Funny how people decide your worth before you even get a chance to speak. The spotlight hit Emily Carter before her name was even fully announced, a harsh white beam that flattened every detail into something exposed, something easy to judge, and for a brief second, the entire studio leaned forward, not to listen, but to look. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she walked to center stage, shoulders straight, chin level, carrying herself with a quiet steadiness that didn't match the story already forming in the host's voice, because Daniel Brooks was smiling in that polished, late-night way, the kind that never quite reached his eyes, and before she could even reach for the microphone, he tilted his head and said, "So this is Emily Carter, single mom, right?" And the audience responded exactly how he expected, a ripple of chuckles, light but sharp enough to land, while somewhere off to the side, a stagehand adjusted a cable and the microphone in front of her flickered once, then went silent. A small technical failure that stretched just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough for Daniel to step in again, filling the gap she never got to claim. Raising a kid alone in this economy. That's gotta be tough, he added, his tone hovering between sympathy and something colder. Something that invited the crowd to look at her not as a guest, but as a situation, and Emily didn't interrupt, didn't signal the crew, didn't even glance down at the dead mic in her hand. She simply stood there, letting the silence expand around her like it belonged to her, while the camera tightened its frame, capturing the subtle details, the way her fingers rested lightly along the microphone's edge, the calm rhythm of her breathing. The stillness in her gaze as she looked past Daniel and directly into the lens, as if she were speaking to someone far beyond the room, and behind the curtain, unnoticed by most, a man in a dark suit paused mid-step, his attention fixed entirely on her, while the control booth flickered with sudden activity, hushed voices layering over each other, and yet on stage, Daniel continued, unaware or unwilling to notice the shift beginning to unfold around him. "Tell us, Emily," he said, leaning slightly forward, confident, composed. "How do you even manage?" And for the first time, the room waited, not because they expected something powerful, but because they assumed there was nothing she could say that would change what they had already decided. And still, she didn't speak, not yet. Her silence wasn't hesitation, it was timing, and somewhere deep in the structure of the show, something had already started to move. The silence did not belong to the stage, it belonged to her, and for a moment longer than expected, it stretched across the room like something tangible, something people could feel but could not quite explain, and Daniel Brooks shifted slightly. Just enough to reclaim control, just enough to remind everyone who was supposed to lead the narrative. "Take your time," he said with a soft chuckle, glancing briefly toward the crew as if the technical issue was part of the act, while a few audience members leaned back in their seats, their attention already beginning to drift, convinced they had seen this story before, convinced they knew exactly how it would end. But Emily Carter did not move to fix the microphone. She did not signal for help. Instead, she slowly lowered it by her side, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, and in that quiet decision, something subtle shifted, because she was no longer trying to fit into the frame they had prepared for her. She was stepping outside of it, and somewhere in the control booth, a producer removed his headset halfway, listening more carefully now, while another screen lit up with a file that had not been part of the original rundown, a name highlighted in bold, a detail overlooked, or perhaps ignored, and behind the curtain, the man in the dark suit took one step closer to the edge, his presence still unnoticed by the audience, but not by the staff, not anymore. And back under the lights, Daniel continued, filling the space with polished words. "You know, our viewers love real stories, the kind that show struggle, resilience, the everyday battles," he said, his tone warm on the surface, but there was an edge beneath it, an assumption that her story was small enough to be summarized, simple enough to be consumed, and still Emily said nothing, her eyes briefly lowering, not in defeat, but in memory. Because somewhere behind that calm exterior lived the image of a small apartment just over 600 square feet, where mornings began before sunrise and nights ended long after the city went quiet, where a child's backpack rested by the door and a second job waited after the first, where exhaustion never had the final word, and she carried all of that into this moment without needing to explain it, without needing permission to be understood. And when she finally looked up again, it was not toward Daniel, it was toward the camera, steady and unshaken. As if she knew something no one else in the room had realized yet, and in the background, the screens flickered once more, unnoticed by most, but enough to make the control room go completely still. Daniel Brooks was still smiling, but it no longer held the same ease, because something in the room had shifted in a way he could not fully control, and he felt it not through what he saw, but through what he did not hear. The laughter had softened, the scattered murmurs fading into a quieter kind of attention, and he adjusted his stance, subtly tightening his grip on the cue cards in his hand. "You know," he continued, his voice carrying just enough confidence to steady himself, "people love a comeback story, but not everyone gets one," and this time the reaction was slower, uncertain, as if the audience was waiting for permission to respond, and Emily Carter remained exactly where she stood, her shoulders relaxed, her expression calm. Her silence no longer empty but deliberate, and it was in that stillness that her past seemed to rise without being spoken, a series of moments stitched together in quiet persistence, early mornings when the alarm clock rang at 5:30, the soft hum of a coffee maker in a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in, the weight of a sleeping child carried from couch to bed after a long night, the glow of a laptop screen at the edge of midnight where numbers and plans replaced rest, and every choice measured not in comfort but in necessity, and none of it asked for recognition, none of it needed to be explained, because it lived in the way she stood now, grounded, unshaken, while behind the scenes, the control room had gone completely still. One producer staring at the monitor where her name was now linked to files that should have been reviewed before the show ever began, financial reports, partnership agreements, a foundation quietly funding initiatives across multiple states, details that did not match the story being told on stage, and a second producer leaned in closer, whispering something urgent, their eyes flicking between screens and the stage, while backstage, the man in the dark suit had stepped fully into view of the crew. His presence no longer ignorable, his posture composed, his gaze fixed only on Emily, and one assistant hesitated before approaching him, recognizing him too late, because on stage, Daniel was still speaking, still trying to guide the narrative back into something manageable. "So tell me," he said, his tone sharpening just slightly, "what is the hardest part of being on your own?" And for the first time, Emily moved, not toward the microphone, but away from it. A small step that drew the camera's focus even tighter, and when she lifted her eyes again, there was no trace of uncertainty, only a quiet certainty that something was about to change, not because she demanded it, but because the truth had already begun to surface on its own. The air in the studio no longer felt light. It carried a quiet pressure that no one had planned for, and while Daniel Brooks waited for an answer that still had not come, the delay was beginning to work against him. Because every second Emily Carter chose not to speak made his question feel smaller, less important, and somewhere in the control room, a decision was being made without words. A producer reached forward and tapped a screen, hesitated, then pulled his hand back, unsure whether to interrupt the live broadcast or let it unfold, because what they were seeing now was no longer part of the script. It was something else entirely, something they had failed to recognize earlier, and the monitors displayed fragments of information that did not align with the narrative on stage, financial summaries tied to a name they had only labeled as a guest, legal documents stamped and dated, a foundation that had quietly funded after-school programs, housing assistance, and small business grants across more than 10 states, all under the same name now standing under a muted spotlight. And back on stage, Emily shifted her weight slightly, a natural movement, unforced, but enough to draw every camera angle tighter around her presence, and when she finally lifted her hand, it was not to fix the microphone, it was simply to brush a strand of hair behind her ear, calm, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed to match her pace, while backstage, the man in the dark suit was no longer observing from a distance. He had stepped fully into the light behind the curtain, and a staff member quickly moved aside to let him pass, recognition clear in their expression now, a quiet urgency, replacing earlier indifference. And still, Daniel continued, though the confidence in his voice had thinned. "Emily, our audience is really interested in your journey," he said, adjusting his tone, trying to recover control. But his words no longer landed the same way, because the audience was no longer looking at her through his lens. They were watching her directly now, noticing what had been there from the beginning: the composure, the restraint, the absence of any need to defend herself. And in that moment, Emily took a single step forward, not toward him, but toward the edge of the stage, toward the camera, toward something unseen but already in motion. And though she still had not spoken, it was clear that whatever came next would not be shaped by the questions asked, but by the truth that had quietly been waiting to reveal itself. From where she stood, the edge of the stage no longer felt like a boundary, it felt like a threshold, and Emily Carter paused there just long enough for the shift in the room to settle into something undeniable. Because now the cameras were no longer guided solely by the host, they were drawn to her by something quieter, something steadier. And in the control room, a decision finally tipped. A producer leaned forward and spoke into his headset with a lowered voice. "Pull up the sponsor file," and within seconds, the monitors began to populate with information that had been sitting unnoticed in the system. Cross-references, ownership percentages, silent partnerships tied to a name they had treated as ordinary, and one by one, the expressions in the room began to change, subtle at first, then unmistakable, while backstage, the man in the dark suit stepped fully into the corridor that led toward the stage, his pace measured, unhurried, as if he had already decided there was no need to rush, because the moment was already unfolding exactly as it should. And on stage, Daniel Brooks felt it before he understood it, the way the audience no longer reacted on cue, the way the energy no longer followed his voice, and he cleared his throat softly, adjusting his stance again. "Emily," he said, this time with a trace of caution woven into his tone, "we just want to understand your experience." But the words no longer carried authority. They hovered instead, uncertain, because Emily had not moved back, had not reclaimed the microphone. And yet she had taken control of the space simply by refusing to be defined within it, and for a brief second, her eyes shifted, not toward Daniel, not toward the audience, but toward the side of the stage where the curtain moved slightly, where the man in the dark suit had come into view, their gaze meeting in a way that did not need explanation, a recognition that spoke of history, of trust built outside the reach of this room. And then she looked forward again, calm, composed, as the screens behind her flickered once more, brighter this time, preparing for something that had not been announced, something that no longer needed permission. And though she still had not spoken a single word, it was now clear to everyone watching that the story they thought they were witnessing had already been rewritten, not by noise, not by argument, but by a truth that was about to step fully into the light. The shift no longer hid behind subtlety, it moved through the studio like a quiet current, and one by one, the people who had been watching casually began to sit a little straighter, their attention no longer guided by Daniel Brooks, but pulled toward something they could not yet fully see. And in the control room, the final hesitation disappeared as a senior producer gave a single nod, his voice steady as he spoke into the headset. "Put it up," and within seconds, the massive LED screen behind Emily Carter came alive, not with graphics prepared for entertainment, but with something far more precise, a clean, minimal display that carried weight without needing decoration. And at first, it was only a name, simple, centered, unmistakable, Emily Carter, followed by a series of lines that began to populate beneath it: ownership records, board affiliations, verified documentation that connected her to entities far larger than the narrative that had been placed on her moments ago. And the audience reacted not with laughter this time, but with silence, the kind that forms when understanding begins to replace assumption. While on stage, Daniel felt it instantly, his posture tightening as his eyes flicked toward the screen behind her, reading faster than he could process, and for the first time since the show began, he did not speak. Not because he chose not to, but because he no longer knew what to say, and Emily remained exactly where she was, not turning around to acknowledge the display, not reacting to the shift, because she already knew what it showed. She had never needed it to validate her, and from the side of the stage, the man in the dark suit stepped forward into clearer view, his presence now impossible to ignore, and a quiet recognition moved through the crew. A name whispered under breath, Alexander Hayes. A figure known in rooms far removed from this one, and yet he did not interrupt, did not announce himself. He simply stood there, watching, as if this moment belonged entirely to her. And in the audience, a few people began to exchange glances, piecing together what they were seeing, what they had missed, what they had assumed too quickly, and under the fading dominance of the spotlight, Emily finally reached for the microphone again, not hurried, not reactive, but deliberate, lifting it just enough to hold it near, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, and though she still had not spoken, it was no longer necessary to prove anything, because everything that needed to be known had already begun to reveal itself without her saying a single word. For the first time since she stepped onto the stage, Emily Carter raised the microphone to her lips, and the movement alone was enough to draw every ounce of attention back into a single point, because now the room was no longer waiting out of curiosity. It was waiting out of realization, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, untouched by everything that had been said before. "You asked what the hardest part was," she began, her tone even, not loud, not defensive, just clear. And Daniel Brooks stood beside her, silent now, his earlier confidence replaced by a stillness that felt almost unfamiliar, as if he had stepped into a role he no longer understood. And Emily continued, "It was not the long hours, or the early mornings, or the uncertainty," she said, her gaze fixed forward, not on him, not on the audience, but somewhere beyond. It was realizing how quickly people decide who you are without ever asking, and the words did not land like a rebuttal. They landed like a reflection, something that lingered rather than struck, and in the audience, no one laughed, no one interrupted, because there was nothing left to dismiss, and behind her, the screen remained lit, the information still visible, no longer just data, but context. And Daniel shifted slightly, glancing again at the display, then back at her, searching for something to say, something to recover the moment, but every option felt smaller now, less certain, and from the side of the stage, Alexander Hayes took another step forward, not rushing, not drawing attention, but present in a way that changed the balance of the room entirely, and a quiet recognition spread through the audience as well, a few heads turning, whispers forming, connecting the name on the screen to the man now standing in clear view, and yet he did nothing to claim the moment. He did not interrupt, did not speak, because this was not his to control, and Emily, still composed, allowed a brief pause to settle after her words, not filling the space, not explaining further, and in that pause, the shift completed itself, because the audience was no longer looking at her as a guest, or a story, or a subject to be interpreted. They were looking at her as someone who had never needed to prove anything at all, and when she lowered the microphone slightly, her expression unchanged, it was clear that whatever power had been taken from her at the beginning of the show had never truly left her. It had only been waiting for the right moment to be seen. The silence that followed her words was not empty, it was heavy with understanding, and for the first time that night, no one looked to Daniel Brooks to guide what came next, because the moment no longer belonged to him, it had shifted entirely. And he felt it in the way his usual instincts failed him, the way every prepared line now felt misplaced, and he cleared his throat quietly, glancing once more at the screen behind Emily Carter, then back at her, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. "Emily, I think we may have misunderstood," he said, the words careful, measured, no longer designed to entertain but to correct, and in the audience, the shift became visible, people leaning forward not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Their earlier assumptions dissolving into something quieter, something more aware, while the large display behind her continued to hold steady, no longer flashing, no longer changing, because it did not need to, it had already said enough. And from the side of the stage, Alexander Hayes stepped forward fully, crossing into the light without hesitation, his presence immediately recognized by those who understood the weight of it, and a soft murmur moved through the room, not loud, but unmistakable. And yet he did not take center stage. He did not speak over her or interrupt the moment. Instead, he stopped a few steps behind, close enough to be seen, far enough to let her remain the focus, a quiet confirmation rather than a declaration. And Emily did not turn to acknowledge him, not because she did not notice, but because she did not need to, the connection between them already clear in the way the room responded, and Daniel, standing just to her side, adjusted his posture again, his earlier confidence now replaced with something more careful, more aware. "You are more than what we introduced tonight," he said, his tone steady but subdued, and this time there was no reaction of laughter, no ripple of amusement, only a stillness that carried weight, because the audience had already seen it, already understood it, and Emily simply held the microphone at a relaxed distance, her expression unchanged, her composure intact, not absorbing the apology, not rejecting it, just allowing it to exist without needing to respond, and in that quiet balance, it became clear that the shift in tone was not something she had forced. It was something the room had arrived at on its own, guided not by confrontation, but by the undeniable presence of truth. Emily Carter did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because she understood something the room was only beginning to learn, that not every moment required a response, and not every apology required acceptance. And she let the weight of what had already been revealed settle fully into place before she moved again, her hand lowering the microphone just slightly as her gaze drifted across the audience, not searching for approval, not measuring their reaction, but simply acknowledging the shift that had taken place without her asking for it, and beside her, Daniel Brooks stood quieter than he had been all evening, his posture no longer commanding the space, but adjusting within it, as if recognizing that the role he had played no longer fit the reality in front of him, and behind her, the illuminated screen remained steady, the information unchanged, no longer a surprise, but a confirmation of something deeper. Something that had always been true regardless of whether it had been seen, and from a few steps away, Alexander Hayes remained exactly where he had chosen to stand, present but not imposing, his attention still on her, not to claim credit, not to intervene, but to witness, and that was enough. Because the moment had never been about revealing him, it had been about revealing her, and Emily finally lifted the microphone one last time, her voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room. "I did not come here to change anyone's mind," she said, each word placed with quiet intention. "I came here because I was invited," and she paused, not for effect, but because nothing more needed to be added, and in that pause, the meaning settled deeper than any explanation could have, because she had not defended herself, she had not argued, she had not asked to be understood, she had simply existed in her truth long enough for it to be seen, and that was what changed everything, and as she lowered the microphone for the final time, she turned slightly. Not toward the host, not toward the screen, but toward the path leading off the stage, and without hesitation, she began to walk, her steps steady, unhurried, as the lights softened around her, and Alexander moved just enough to meet her direction, not leading, not following, but walking beside her as they exited the spotlight together, leaving behind a room that no longer saw her the way it once had, and as the stage lights dimmed and the cameras lingered on the space she had just left, the only thing that remained was the quiet understanding that she had never needed to prove her worth, because it had been there all along, waiting not to be announced, but to be recognized.